Imagine you're a brain. You're trapped inside a dark box. You have no way of directly observing the outside world. All you get are light waves at different frequencies, sound waves at different frequencies, and physical vibrations at different frequencies. There's no way of knowing for certain what is causing those signals. Theoretically, anything could be causing those signals. The brain has no objective, direct way of observing the outside world. And all the inputs the brain receives are signals that could have infinitely many different causes. Maybe a nice way of imagining those inputs are as letters in envelopes which contain important messages. All of the letters have been written in code, so they need to be deciphered, and there are many different cipher keys that could work. But with each different cipher key you use, the contents of the message changes. The second part of the problem is what the brain has control over. To go back to our brain in a box example, for any human or animal brain, that's also connected to a body. This is equivalent to saying that the brain in a box is also connected to a motor machine. This means that the brain can take actions in the world as a response to the inputs it receives. This is about the brain's outputs, its actions. The brain receives incoming signals about the world around it, and it then sends out signals about how to respond to that world. Because of this structure, humans have what's called a central nervous system. The brain sits at the center of that nervous system between these input signals and these output signals. The spinal cord transmits incoming signals from sensory receptors to the brain via afferent neurons. The brain processes those signals and then sends out signals via efferent neurons, again along the spinal cord, to the motor neurons that control how our bodies move in the world. These incoming and outgoing signals transmitted by afferent and efferent neurons run all the way along the spinal cord. Okay, so far I've not said anything controversial. This is how the brain processes information. And on a macro scale, this is one reason why a lot of neuroscientists consider the brain to be a computer. But before I go any further, it's probably best that we quickly define what we mean by a computer. Okay, I don't want to offend anyone. Everyone knows what a modern day computer is. If you're watching me on YouTube right now, then you're watching me on some form of computer. But the machines we know today are just one type of computer. And originally, computers were people. Back at the start of the Second World War, before Alan Turing had invented the computer machine, humans were computers. Lots of mathematical calculations needed to be done, and the people who did these calculations were called computers. Eventually machinery evolved, and computers went from being the women who manually calculated these calculations in their heads to being the machines that run these calculations automatically on their hardware. But at a very general level, computation is about taking a set of inputs and turning them into an output. And a computer is the thing that turns those inputs into outputs. In the case of human computers, they were given huge sets of numbers as their inputs. They had to manually calculate very difficult calculations using pen and paper, and then record the results of those calculations. But fundamentally, anything that takes in a set of inputs, conducts some sort of process on those inputs, and returns an output is a computer. Now, if we return to the big picture of what the brain is doing, we have a system that is receiving a bunch of inputs related to light, sound, touch, taste, and smell. We call these our senses or perception. At a very simplistic level, the brain then takes in all those inputs, runs some kind of process on those signals to produce an output. That output is the action which our brain wants us to take. That is communicated to our body via efferent neurons and motor neurons, which we spoke about before, and actions are then taken in the world. At the level of the nervous system, therefore, hopefully you can see why neuroscientists consider the brain to be a computer. Now let's look one level deeper and go inside the brain, to the level of brain structure. The key assumption of modern neuroscience, that the brain performs specific functions, originates from cases of individual patients who had localized brain damage. The most famous example was a guy called Phineas Gage, who was a construction worker and one day took a pipe through his skull. The miraculous thing about him was that he survived. He lost a huge part of his frontal lobes, but he could continue to function in day-to-day life. However, after some time went by, his friends and family began to realise that Phineas wasn't the same person as he was before the accident. Whilst before he was hard-working, reliable and polite, after the accident he became lazy and aggressive, unable to hold down a job and reliant on heavy alcohol use. This was the first proper clue that the brain was responsible for our behaviour and that specific parts of the brain were responsible for specific functions. Brain damage can occur from accidents like falls or car crashes, but also internal issues like strokes or infections. Brain damage happens all over the brain, and scientists have mapped the location of brain damage incidents to impaired functions to infer something about what those specific brain areas do. For example, people who had a damaged amygdala were no longer able to assess danger or threats in their environment. People who had a damaged hippocampus were no longer able to recall specific memories from their past. And people who had a damaged occipital cortex suffered vision problems. Remember the input to output diagram for computation? My point here is that patients with brain damage offer very clear examples of cases where the output is impaired. It's like the box has been broken and now whatever it was doing before doesn't work. Of course, this is a massive oversimplification, and an impaired output could be caused by many different factors at many different levels of abstraction. An impaired output could be caused by a broken computation, or it could just as easily be impaired by a broken input. For example, when someone loses their eyesight as a result of a bad accident to their eye, they lose their vision because the input to the occipital cortex is cut off. Their occipital cortex is still working fine, but there's an issue with the input signals. Or it could be impaired by both input and computation, or it could be impaired by impaired connections between any of these three components. So as well as the central nervous system operating via this input-output process, when we zoom in closer to different parts of the brain, we find that this input-output process also applies on that scale too. And finally, we're going to zoom in one layer deeper and look at what goes on at the level of individual neurons. Without going too much into the neurobiology of how neurons work, the main thing you need to know is the structure of a neuron. Remember again our diagram of what a computation is. These three sections, input, computation, output, nicely map onto the three parts of a neuron. The anatomy of a neuron at a macro scale can be split up into three parts: the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon terminal. Very generally, this is the structure of all neurons. Signals are received via these branch things called dendrites. Those signals are then aggregated in the cell body, where some process decides whether or not to release an action potential. This action potential is a yes-no output. If an action potential is reached, this yes output signal then propagates down the axon towards the synapse, where that output message is transmitted to neighbouring neurons via the synaptic cleft. Those neighbouring neurons receive that message as their input via their dendrites, and the whole process starts over again. The fact that neurons work using this binary off-on signalling via action potentials most clearly maps to our modern understanding of bits, binary digits of zeros and ones in modern computers. And there we go, at three levels of abstraction, from the central nervous system to localized brain structure to the anatomy of neurons. I've given you some explanations for why modern neuroscience considers the brain to be a computer. A natural next question is, what are the algorithms or software that it uses? We will look into that question in more detail in my next video. It's important to emphasize that the information processing model of neuroscience is one theory for how the brain works. This video has provided a summary of that theory. The main references I've used to pull together this summary can be found at the end of the video. This theory explains a lot of data, and in neuroscience and cognitive science, the information processing theory of the brain is the dominant view, but it is still only a model, and there are many different ways the theory can be critiqued. If you have issues with this theory, like potential critiques, or you have feedback about anything that I might have missed, or ideas you want to see more of, then drop me a message in the comments below. Thanks very much for listening.